So in the last part of this video, I talked about how new species can get started, but what keeps those new species going? So now we need to talk about mechanisms of reproductive isolation. So these are mechanisms that keep species isolated from each other. And the reason we have to talk about this is that if you have two newly different species, there can often be a big problem that arises. If you have two species that are very similar to each other, living things make mistakes, so they may continue to try reproducing with each other, these new species. And when this happens, what often will occur is interbreeding between those new species may produce offspring that have lower fitness. And if that weren't the case, then you wouldn't actually have different species, right? If the fitness were higher from interbreeding and they were able to successfully interbreed, you'd be talking about populations of the same species, not newly different species. So, to give you an example of this, here's an example of two toad species that are found throughout different parts of Europe. So there's one toad species called the yellow-bellied toad here on the left. You can see it has a nice yellow belly. And then on the other side, throughout Eurasia, we've got a toad that's called the fire-bellied toad. So it has a more orangey, fiery colored belly. And these are distinct species from each other, but they do come into geographic contact with each other now. And so there's a point where the species ranges for each of these species overlaps. And where that overlap happens, these two species have the potential to contact each other, and so there's a hybrid zone that forms. And so if these individuals interbreed with each other in the hybrid zone, then their offspring may not be able to reproduce. They'll have lower fitness somehow. That would be detrimental at that hybrid zone. So what's going on there? How can species overcome this potential problem? So here's one way that newly formed species kind of solve this problem of avoiding mating with the wrong individual. So for example, there can be changes to the mating displays that those species use. So to give you an example of this, here's an example of two flycatcher bird species, the willow flycatcher and the alder flycatcher. And I mean, if you and I just look at these birds, these look like two little brown birds. There's really not all that much that differs between them. So the main way that these birds tell apart other individuals of the same or alternate species is through very distinct mating calls. So the willow flycatcher has a mating call that sounds like Fitzbew, and the alder flycatcher, in contrast, has a mating call that sounds like Phoebe-o. So a male bird will make this sound. He'll say either Fitzbew or Phoebe-o, and then the female will listen, and she'll listen for the correct song, and that's how she knows that that's the appropriate potential male bird to mate with. Also, in other cases, there might be other distinguishing traits that are exaggerated that help individuals of each species find other individuals of the same species. So there could be an increase in some kind of morphological difference. A morphological difference is just a physical characteristic. So for the yellow-bellied and fire-bellied toads, the coloration of toads found in that hybrid zone might be exaggerated to help facilitate finding the correct partner for mating. So we refer to these types of species isolating mechanisms as reinforcement mechanisms. So I want to give you kind of a set of formal terms to describe the mechanisms that different organisms use to reduce the frequency of hybridization and reduce those costs of hybridization. And broadly speaking, those mechanisms get divided up according to whether they take place before any mating happens or whether they take place after mating has occurred and fertilization has occurred. So they're referred to as either pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms or post-zygotic isolating mechanisms, so relative to zygote formation. So to kind of think about these. So the prezygotic isolating mechanisms are mechanisms that are going to prevent animals from breeding in the first place. So avoiding mating or somehow prevent fertilization in some fashion. And we'll look at more examples of these during our lecture activity time together. For postzygotic isolating mechanisms, this is reduced survival or fertility of any hybrids that are produced. So to give you an example of a postzygotic species isolation situation, it's possible for horses and donkeys to be bred together, and the offspring are completely viable. That's how we wind up getting mules, but mules themselves are sterile and no further reproduction happens. And you might notice that with the postzygotic species isolation mechanism, there's still a lot of cost to the individual organism, that's gone to the trouble of reproducing and gestating in many cases this hybrid individual. So in general, there's very strong selection favoring the development of prezygotic isolating mechanisms to maintain distinct species. And this isn't really like a purposeful thing on the part of the species as a whole. Instead, it's mechanisms that contribute to the maintenance of distinct species. And actually this brings us to a point, which is that reinforcement isn't the only thing that happens when there is hybrid zone contact between two newly formed species. So I've got a little cartoon here that kind of illustrates what happens through time over the course of species formation. So again, you start out with a single species with a discrete population. So there's gene flow within that population among all the individuals in that population. Then at some point over the course of time, some kind of barrier to gene flow or barrier to reproduction between individuals gets introduced into that population. So that's either a geographic barrier or some other type of barrier to gene flow. So what that's going to do is then it's going to isolate that original population, divide it into subpopulations, and allow for time to progress for genetic divergence between those populations. And the idea with the hybrid zone is that there are some factors that at some point then allow for contact between these newly formed species. So in cases where the fitness of hybrid individuals is lower, and where reinforcement happens, then you're going to have maintenance of two distinct species. But there's some other interesting things that can happen as well. For example, it might be that upon contact, those two newly formed species could actually fuse back together again if conditions favor that. And alternately, there can also be circumstances where there winds up being a stable hybrid zone between species. So to give you some examples of this, with our ability to now sequence genomes, we know a lot more about the genetic relationships between different species and within individuals within a species. And that's actually allowed us to identify more cases where these types of events take place. So we very recently learned that there's been one of these fusion events that has happened in the common raven. So this map here in purple shows you the geographic distribution of the common raven. So as with many flying birds, this species range is very extensive across the northern reaches of all the northern continents. But historically, there's also been some geographic events that led to separation of a raven population into what is now known as the Chihuahuan raven. So this is a genetically distinct species of raven. However, there was also contact between the Chihuahuan raven, this newly forming species, and the common raven in the southwestern U.S. And we know from genetic evidence that there, in a subsequent speciation event, there was then fusion back into the common raven species. So we now have two species. We have the Chihuahuan raven, we have the common raven, and then where this fusion event took place across this range in the western part of the U.S., down through through Central America, we now have a population that has kind of a genetic mosaic from this fusion event that took place. And so here's how we get that third scenario where a stable hybrid zone forms. Usually that occurs when there is extensive and ongoing gene flow from the surroundings. So highly mobile populations that continually come into contact, where in the majority of the population range, they're distinct species, but that contact gets reinforced in a hybrid zone. So with the toad example, the two parent species of those two toads will routinely migrate into that hybrid zone, and there will be some level of reproduction in that hybrid zone, but the fitness of those hybrids is lower than the fitness of individuals where there isn't hybridization. So that maintains the hybrid zone without, because they can still interbreed with each other over time. Okay, so I want to come back to something that I brought up towards the start of this set of videos, which is, okay, so there are a lot of ways that it's possible to go from a single original species to new species, so to have these speciation events take place. So it might get you to wondering, so can these speciation mechanisms, somehow help to save us in the face of, this sixth mass extinction that is taking place? And to think about this, I think it's important to kind of appreciate some of the consequences of a mass extinction event. When a mass extinction occurs, that can have a dramatic impact on different ecological communities, so different species interacting with each other, and also in kind of the niches that are available in those different communities, so different roles within that community that organisms can assume. So the unfortunate news is that no, speciation mechanisms are probably not going to save us in the face of the sixth mass extinction, because it can take somewhere on the order of 5 to 100 million years for biodiversity to recover after a mass extinction event. So we are not going to see a recovery from the sixth extinction, over our lifetimes, or, over, the imaginable future generations as well. And in addition, it's important to realize that when a mass extinction happens and when a recovery event happens after that, there can be very dramatic changes in the types of organisms that wind up being found in the future ecological communities. Okay, so now that we've talked more about mechanisms of reproductive isolation, I want to wrap back around to ask the question of, okay, well, what is a species really? And talk a little more about some of these alternative species concepts that contrast with the biological species concept. We have to do this again because, while we might want to have a definition of a species, the biological reality is much more complex than that. So here's 3 conundrums. So for one thing, if our working definition of the biological species concept relates to interbreeding populations, I've got this little cartoon up here of a crying microbe, because this crying microbe, every bacteria, that reproduces using bacterial fission, it's not reproducing with other individuals. So by that biological species definition, that suggests that every bacteria is its own species. That really does not work. In addition, we have other cases where if we look through the fossil record, we can find a fossil of an organism that looks like this T-Rex here, but how are we going to find out who that T-Rex can interbreed with? We can't go back and, check because there's no way to do that experiment. It's dead. It's extinct. All we have are fossils. And then as a third example, here's two organisms that can successfully interbreed, so a grizzly bear and a polar bear. These can reproduce with each other, and when they do reproduce, they produce a hybrid called a growler bear. And growler bears are completely, they're functional, they're able to reproduce. But we still kind of sit back on our heels and go, but polar bears and grizzly bears are really different from each other. It doesn't really make sense to call them the same thing, because if we just observe everything about their life histories, they're very distinct from each other. Okay, so here's our questions. How do you test interbreeding with fossils? Is it a grizzly bear and polar bear, or are they the same thing? We're missing sexual reproduction. And what a lot of this comes down to is that, as I've been showing you mechanisms of speciation and the process of speciation, I hope you've come to appreciate that that is really not a discrete process. It's a continuous process. So we go from a single species over time, then that single species diverges into two different species, and then eventually we arrive at something that we can call two different species. And the biological species concept, in contrast, is relying on a very discrete definition of what a species is. Can you interbreed or not? That's the end of the story. So, to address that, here are some other species concepts that biologists will use. And in general, you have to decide on what makes the most sense depending on the types of systems that you're studying and the types of questions that you're interested in. So to give one example, another species concept is called the morphological species concept. So that's based on an organism's morphology, its physical characteristics and features. So the morphological species concept then groups organisms based on shared physical features. So that saves our T-Rex here. We can call it a T-Rex because it shares physical features with other individuals, and that collectively then is our species. So we typically would define a morphological species kind of somewhere in the intermediate stage of the speciation process. Another species concept is called the phylogenetic species concept. And this is based on knowing more about the evolutionary history of a group of organisms. So a phylogenetic species is defined by having a shared common ancestor. And so to give you an example of this, I've got this picture of some salamander species down here. And there's a set of salamander populations that are found in somewhat distinct regions in California. So they're not entirely breeding with each other. But if we trace things back, we can identify that these are all much more closely related to each other than they are to this other salamander species. And so based on the phylogenetic species concept, since we know that these share the same ancestor, we can refer to these as being the same species. We've grouped them together as a species. And then finally, another concept is called the ecological species concept. And this is defined more directly by the animals or organisms' ecological niche. So again, since grizzly bears and polar bears occupy different habitats, they eat different things, they really don't interact with each other. They occupy unique ecological niches. That concept, works pretty well for trying to think about and make sense of, these different populations of bears. Okay, so that takes us through our thinking around macroevolution, species concepts and some of the mechanisms of speciation and the mechanisms that contribute to reproductive isolation in many cases. And so hopefully that sort of opened a new perspective on how over evolutionary time life on Earth has gone from very humble origins to producing the tremendous and beautiful biodiversity that we observe in the world today.